The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 19, Authenticity Living Real, not performed. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we strip away performance, confront the habits we didn't know we had, and sit with the uncomfortable truths about what it means to be real. Today, we're talking about authenticity, not the Instagram-ready kind, but the real thing. In a world where self-expression is marketed as a lifestyle, it's easy to confuse being seen with being known. The result? We end up performing versions of ourselves we didn't even realize we were rehearsing. Whether it's curating the perfect post, softening an opinion to keep the peace, or shaping our tone to fit a room, most of us have learned the art of adjusting. Sometimes that's survival. But over time, if we only ever show the parts that are easiest for others to accept, we risk losing touch with the rest of who we are. This episode is about unlearning those habits, noticing where performance has replaced presence, and building the kind of realness that doesn't need an audience to feel alive. We'll explore both the digital and the everyday, from the pressures of online identity to the subtle edits we make in person, and how to bridge the gap between how we present and how we truly live. The mask that smiles back theme, the quiet weight of performativity in both digital and physical spaces. We often wear versions of ourselves tailored to be acceptable, likable, or impressive. The danger isn't just that we hide, it's that we begin to forget what we look like without the mask. Attributes. 1. Curated self, presenting an edited version of who we are. Context. Social media invites us to highlight wins, filter flaws, and shape narratives. Offline, this shows up in job interviews, networking events, or even dinner parties, where we subtly edit out what doesn't fit the room. 2. Audience dependence, measuring value by external approval. Context. Engagement metrics online mimic applause. In person, approval comes through compliments, invitations, or visible signs of acceptance. Both create a feedback loop where the self is sustained by performance. 3. Identity fatigue, the exhaustion from maintaining multiple selves. Context. Managing different versions of ourselves across contexts, professional, personal, and online, drains mental and emotional energy, leaving little space for authentic expression to emerge. The mirror that talks back. There's a mirror in the modern world that doesn't just reflect, it replies. Sometimes with a like, a laugh, or a nod of approval. Other times with silence or disinterest. The moment we realize the mirror is watching, not just reflecting, our behavior shifts. We smooth our shirt before the selfie. We rehearse the anecdote before the meeting. We tone down the opinion that might not land well in the group chat. It starts small, a subtle alignment with what works. Post the photo that gets the heart reactions. Share the story that makes people laugh instead of the one that makes them think. Wear the smile that says, "I'm fine," even when you're not. The mask becomes second nature, and the more it's rewarded, the harder it is to take off. The scariest part. After a while, the mask doesn't just fool the world, it starts to fool you. Personal reflection. I've lived this split life. Offline, I've been the agreeable coworker who swallowed dissent to keep harmony. Online, I've been tempted to polish my words until they fit a brand, even when brand was never the intention. The truth is, I've felt the rush of validation from saying what people wanted to hear, and the sting of silence when I said what was real but unpopular. There was a time when I caught myself editing not just my posts, but my thoughts before I even wrote them down, as if some imaginary audience was already in the room, judging. It took me years to see that this constant self-editing wasn't protecting me. It was erasing me. The gap between my public face and private reality grew so wide that stepping across it felt like breaking character. And when that happens, it's not just tiring, it's lonely, because no one is seeing you. Psychological insight. What we're talking about here has deep roots in Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory of social interaction, which describes life as a stage where we manage impressions for different audiences. In today's world, the stage has multiplied. We perform not just for colleagues or family, but for a potentially infinite online crowd. Psychologists have found that this constant impression management can lead to what's known as self-discrepancy theory. Higgins, 1987, the gap between your actual self, ideal self, and ought self. The bigger the gap, the more likely you are to experience anxiety, guilt, or low self-esteem. I've seen this in my own work and personal life. When I tried to maintain a perfectly on-brand version of myself, it became exhausting to keep up the act. Conversations felt rehearsed, and even my online writing felt like it was auditioning for approval rather than expressing something true. Once, during a talk I gave on authenticity, I realized mid-sentence that I was performing authenticity, trying to sound raw and real instead of just being raw and real. That moment hit me hard. Insight prompt. Where in your life are you curating instead of simply showing up? Theory in action. Try a mask audit this week. In every space you enter, online, work, friendships, ask yourself, what part of me is leading here and what part am I hiding? Write it down. Patterns will start to appear. When real meets the room theme. The collision of truth and expectation authenticity often feels effortless until it meets resistance. The moment your real self doesn't align with the spoken or unspoken rules of the room, you face a choice, stay true or adjust to fit. Attributes. 1. Social editing, the instinct to adjust language, tone, or content to match the group's norms. Context. This may be subtle, swapping a strong opinion for a softer one, or drastic, like avoiding a topic entirely because it might create tension. 2. Belonging versus integrity dilemma, the internal tug of war between being accepted and staying authentic. Context. Humans are wired for belonging, but when acceptance requires masking, authenticity becomes the cost of entry. 3. Fear of disruption, avoiding truth-telling to maintain harmony. Context. We often conflate peace with silence, choosing to keep the peace at the expense of saying what matters. The unspoken contract. Every space has a contract, even if it's never written down. At work, the contract might be, we don't talk about politics here. In a family, it might be, we smile for the holidays no matter what. Online, it might be, we keep it light, nothing too heavy. You learn the rules quickly, often without anyone saying them out loud. The moment you break the contract, intentionally or not, the temperature changes. The laughter fades a notch, the energy dips, and someone changes the subject. In that pause, you feel the weight of the choice. Do I stay here in my truth, even if it makes them uncomfortable? Or do I slip back into the safer, smaller version of myself? It's a decision that happens in seconds, but the consequences can linger far longer. Personal reflection. I've been in rooms where I could feel the boundary before I hit it, where the vibe said, stay light, but my gut said, speak up. I remember a conversation with a group of creatives about the pressure to produce safe work. My instinct was to bring up the ways censorship creeps in, not just from outside forces, but from our self-censorship. I could see the shift as soon as I mentioned it. Half the group leaned in, the other half leaned back. In that moment, I felt the pull to pivot, to make a joke to soften what I'd said. I didn't. But I also noticed how quickly my body went into alert, scanning for signs I'd gone too far. That's the thing about these micro moments. They're not just intellectual. They live in your nervous system. And each time you choose to stay with your truth, even when it lands with silence, you teach yourself that authenticity can survive discomfort. Psychological insight. What's at play here is closely related to pluralistic ignorance, a social phenomenon where individuals privately reject a norm, but go along with it because they assume others accept it. When you voice something real that challenges the unspoken agreement, you break the illusion, which can feel threatening to the group. From a psychological safety standpoint, Amy Edmondson's research, people are far more likely to suppress authentic expression if they fear negative consequences, from losing favor to damaging relationships. In my own experience, I've seen this happen during group projects where the safe approach wasn't the best one. Speaking up risked slowing progress and creating tension, but holding back meant endorsing something I didn't believe in. I've learned that those moments aren't just about courage. They're about deciding whose trust matters more, theirs or mine. Insight prompt. Where in your life do you feel the unspoken rules of the room shaping your voice? Theory in action. Next time you sense yourself self-editing, pause. Ask, if I trusted this space to handle the truth, what would I say? Even if you don't speak it aloud, notice what it is. That's where your authenticity lives. The mask that slipped. There's a moment when you catch yourself mid-performance and realize you didn't even know you were on stage. Theme: the subtle drift into performance authenticity isn't always lost in one big compromise. Often it slips away gradually. We learn which parts of ourselves land well with others, which parts earn approval, and we start to lean on them. Not out of manipulation, but because they feel safe. Over time, this curated self can become so practiced that it runs without our awareness. Attributes unconscious curation, filtering yourself in ways you no longer notice. Context: this often stems from early experiences of reward or rejection, where certain behaviors became safe defaults. Over time, it stops feeling like a choice. Comfort in the familiar, sticking with known expressions and stories because they work. Context: this is less about deception and more about efficiency, using patterns that feel reliable, even if they're no longer fresh. Gradual identity narrowing, the shrinking of your visible self to the parts you know will be accepted. Context: without realizing, you start leaving entire sides of yourself out of public view, making connections feel strangely hollow. The performance you don't see. There's a certain relief in having a safe version of yourself to rely on. You know which jokes land, which stories earn smiles, and which parts of your life are best left unsaid. It's not calculated, it's survival through familiarity. The tricky part is that this version can quietly take over. The longer you lead with it, the harder it becomes to step outside it without feeling exposed. And the real loss isn't just to others, it's to yourself. You start forgetting the feeling of being met exactly as you are, with all your contradictions intact. When that happens, every conversation becomes a kind of performance, not because you want to impress, but because you've forgotten how not to. Personal reflection: I've lived through stretches where my public self became so familiar it almost ran on autopilot. In everyday conversations, whether with colleagues, friends, or even family, I found myself leaning on phrases, tones, and ways of responding that I'd used countless times before. It wasn't that I was trying to put on an act. These patterns were simply the safest and most familiar ways I knew to communicate, shaped by years of conditioned behavior. The mask wasn't false, it was just incomplete. But over time, it became the only version of me most people saw. The strange part was how lonely that could feel. People would connect with what I said, but I'd often leave feeling that the rest of me, the unpolished, more vulnerable parts, had stayed hidden. I remember one moment with a close friend where they told me how inspiring I was, and all I could think was, if you knew the whole of me, you might understand me differently. That's when I realized the mask hadn't been intentional, but even so, it had started to feel like a quiet kind of prison. Psychological insight social psychologists note that what Irving Goffman called the presentation of self often develops unconsciously. We aren't just performing to impress, we're performing to protect. Over time, our brains wire these approved behaviors as default responses, making them feel effortless. But here's the paradox. While these patterns reduce short-term risk of rejection, they can create long-term disconnection from our fuller selves. I've experienced this in small but telling ways. In group settings, I'd sometimes share a story I'd told before, not because it was the most relevant, but because I knew it would land well. It was a way to stay safe, but later I'd feel like I'd left an opportunity for real connection on the table. Insight prompt: where in your life might you be defaulting to a safe version of yourself without realizing it? Theory in action experiment with sharing something small but unscripted in a familiar setting. Notice how it feels both during and after. Psychological insight: the comfort zone collision. Every honest moment begins with a choice. Play to the room or stand with yourself. This section sits inside that heartbeat of hesitation, the tug between being liked and being real, and how to tolerate the discomfort without abandoning your truth. Theme: navigating value clashes in real time. Not every conversation about differences needs to become a debate, but when values collide, it can feel like your very identity is on the line. In a world that rewards agreement and punishes dissent, holding your ground can feel like stepping into open fire. Attributes authenticity under pressure, the ability to remain true to your perspective when faced with disagreement. Context: this often means resisting the urge to soften or hide parts of yourself to avoid conflict. It's not about rigidity. It's about showing up honestly even when it costs comfort. Discomfort tolerance, the capacity to stay present when emotions run high or stakes feel personal. Context. Discomfort tolerance grows when we practice staying in moments that feel tense without rushing to appease or shut down. Constructive disruption, challenging perspectives in a way that aims to build understanding rather than destroy connection. Context. This means shifting from winning the point to keeping the bridge, so disagreement doesn't become permanent division. When beliefs meet the edge, I've so many conversations, both in person and online, teeter on the edge of collapse, because the moment one person feels their worldview is under threat, their defenses snap up. In those moments, the dialogue shifts from curiosity to survival. You can almost feel the air change. Posture stiffens, tone sharpens, and the willingness to hear each other's words narrows. But here's the paradox. Some of the deepest connections I've had were forged in that exact tension, when both people stayed present, not to convert each other, but to keep knowing each other. The disagreement became less of a wall and more of a window into how each of us was shaped. Personal reflection. In my everyday life, I've caught myself softening opinions or omitting certain truths just to avoid making it awkward. Sometimes it was in small moments, a passing comment in a group that I didn't fully agree with, but let slide. Other times, it was in deeper conversations where the stakes felt higher, and I feared the relationship wouldn't survive my honesty. Over time, I noticed how exhausting it became to constantly calculate what parts of myself were safe to show. The realization hit one day in a conversation with a friend where we fundamentally disagreed on something important. Instead of deflecting, I decided to stay with my view, kindly but firmly. They didn't agree by the end, but they respected me more for showing up fully. That moment showed me that disagreement doesn't have to be destructive. It can be clarifying. Psychological insight, according to self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan. Humans have three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Disagreement often threatens at least one of these: autonomy if we feel pressured to conform, relatedness if we fear rejection, competence if our viewpoint is challenged. What often escalates conflict isn't the difference in belief, but the perceived threat to belonging. I've noticed in myself that when I felt safe in a relationship, I could voice disagreement without panic. In less secure dynamics, even mild differences felt risky because I subconsciously linked disagreement to abandonment, a pattern rooted in earlier life experiences. Insight prompt. Think of a time you disagreed with someone important to you. Which need, autonomy, competence, or relatedness, felt most under threat? Theory in action. When disagreement surfaces, pause and name your underlying fear before responding. Then decide whether the conversation needs defense, curiosity, or space. Embodiment prompt or practice. The alignment check authenticity isn't an abstract concept. It's something we can feel in our body when we're aligned, and notice as tension when we're not. Aim. Embodying your real self in daily actions living authentically doesn't mean you never adjust or adapt. It means that even when you do, the core of who you are remains intact. This practice invites you to use your body as a compass, noticing the subtle physical cues that tell you when you're speaking, acting, or engaging from a place of truth versus performance. Attributes, somatic alignment, noticing the physical sensations that accompany truth telling. Context. Many of us ignore these signals because we've been conditioned to prioritize external approval over internal resonance. Learning to detect and trust them can guide us toward more genuine interactions. Micro-corrections, adjusting tone, pace, or body language to return to authenticity mid-conversation. Context. This isn't about controlling perception. It's about recognizing when you've drifted into performance and gently steering back toward yourself. Authentic habituation, building a daily rhythm of small, genuine acts until they become second nature. Context. Consistency in small moments builds resilience against the pull of performative habits. Practicing your alignment. One of the most powerful ways to dismantle performance habits is to bring them into conscious awareness without judgment. If you're in a meeting and notice yourself nodding along but disagree internally, pause. Take a breath, feel your body, and ask yourself, Is what I'm about to say mine, or is it the version of me I think will be accepted? Sometimes the answer will surprise you. The alignment check is less about always delivering perfect truth and more about creating enough awareness to choose rather than react. Personal reflection. In my own life, I've caught myself in small betrayals of authenticity, agreeing to plans I didn't want to keep, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, or softening my opinion so it wouldn't seem too much. None of these were dramatic lies, but they stacked up over time, leaving me feeling a little further from myself each day. The shift began when I started noticing the subtle tightness in my chest, or the way my jaw would clench when I drifted into performance. At first, I didn't always act on those cues, but simply noticing them changed everything. Over time, choosing alignment became less of an effort and more of a habit. Psychological insight neuroscience suggests that our bodies register dissonance before our minds fully process it. The vagus nerve, part of the parasympathetic nervous system, is especially sensitive to shifts in emotional congruence. Porges, 2011. In other words, you often feel the misalignment before you consciously name it. I've experienced this countless times in everyday conversations. My body would subtly lean away, or I'd feel a slight tension in my stomach before I even realized I was about to say something that didn't quite fit my truth. By treating these sensations as early warning signals rather than inconveniences, we create an embodied feedback loop that makes returning to authenticity easier in real time. Insight prompt. What physical sensations do you notice when you're out of alignment with yourself? Theory in action. The next time you feel yourself shifting into performance, pause. Name the sensation in your body, breathe, and see if you can rephrase or redirect your words toward what feels more true, even if it's just a small step closer. Integration moment. Choosing truth over image. When the moment comes to choose between being liked and being real, authenticity is rarely the easier option, but it's always the more freeing one. Aim. Releasing the grip on performance outcomes, authenticity deepens when we stop trying to manage how others see us. This section is about loosening the attachment to being perfectly understood or universally accepted, and trusting that the relationships that matter will survive and even strengthen when you show up unfiltered. Attributes, image detachment, letting go of the need to control how you're perceived. Context. This is a gradual unlearning, especially for those who've relied on approval for safety or connection. Acceptance of imperfect perception, realizing that people will interpret you through their filters. Context. Even the most genuine self-expression will be misread sometimes, and that's not a failure. Trust in self-resonance, anchoring your value in your congruence, not in someone else's opinion. Context. The more you validate your truth, the less fragile it feels in the face of misunderstanding. Letting the mask slip for good, choosing truth over image is like stepping into fresh air after being indoors for too long. At first, the light can feel harsh, and the vulnerability of being seen without the old filters is real. But slowly, you notice the relief of not having to manage the performance. You can speak more slowly, you can answer more honestly, and when disagreements come, you no longer scramble to smooth them over at the cost of yourself. This shift doesn't happen in one dramatic gesture. It's a series of small, repeated choices to keep showing up in your skin. Personal reflection. I used to think the risk of being misunderstood was something to avoid at all costs. In my everyday life, I would sometimes soften my perspective or use language I thought would land more easily, even when it diluted my meaning. The turning point came when I realized that the people who genuinely valued me were drawn to the unfiltered version, the one who didn't edit every sentence for palatability. And there have been moments where my honesty has ended conversations or even cost me opportunities, but the relationships and work that remained felt infinitely lighter. The relief of not holding up an image far outweighs the discomfort of letting some connections go. Psychological insight. Carl Rogers' concept of congruence. The alignment between self-perception and outward expression is foundational in humanistic psychology. When our actions match our inner reality, we foster deeper trust both with ourselves and with others. Rogers, 1961. I've seen this play out in small but significant ways. A friend once told me they appreciated me more after I disagreed with them openly instead of nodding along. That moment cemented my belief that authenticity, while sometimes costly in the short term, pays back in long-term trust and integrity. Insight prompt. When was the last time you prioritized your truth over how you'd be perceived? How did it feel in the moment and afterwards? Theory in action. For the next week, notice one moment each day where you have the choice to either maintain your image or express your truth. Choose the latter and reflect on how it impacts your sense of connection and self-respect. Seed to plant. The long game of realness authenticity isn't a one-off act. It's a practice you commit to over time, even when the payoff isn't immediate. Theme. Sustaining authentic living beyond the moment. This final section is about recognizing that living true is less about dramatic declarations and more about quiet, daily choices that keep you anchored in your values, online and offline. Attributes. Consistency over performance, showing up in the same way whether or not anyone's watching. Context. This builds a self-trust that doesn't depend on an audience or approval. Patience with alignment. Understanding that some connections deepen slowly when they meet authenticity. Context. Not everyone will recognize your truth right away, and that's okay. Integration into all spaces, making your authenticity portable between personal, professional, and digital life. Context. True self-expression feels seamless across contexts rather than compartmentalized. The game of life. The pull toward performance doesn't vanish overnight. Even after committing to a more authentic way of being, there will be moments you're tempted to revert, to post what you think will get more likes, to say what will smooth over a tense conversation, to act in ways that reassure others more than yourself. But with each small act of honesty, you strengthen a muscle that makes future authenticity easier. Over time, the line between your private and public self begins to fade, not because you're sharing everything, but because the parts you do share are rooted in truth, not performance. Personal reflection. I've learned that the rewards of authenticity often come quietly. They show up in the trust of a friend who knows you won't sugarcoat things. In the calm you feel after a conversation where you didn't have to replay what you said to check if it was too much. There have been times I've chosen authenticity in small ways, saying no when it was inconvenient for others, not laughing at a joke I didn't find funny, posting something I cared about even if it wasn't on brand. These weren't big moments, but they added up to a sense of wholeness I'd never found in performance. Psychological insight self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan, 1985, highlights autonomy, the ability to act in ways congruent with your values, as a core human need. The more we act from this space, the more intrinsic motivation we develop to keep doing so. I've noticed in my own life that when I take small, authentic actions, even if they're uncomfortable, they build momentum. One example was declining an offer to work on a project that didn't align with my beliefs. It was financially tempting, but saying no reinforced my trust in myself and eventually opened the door to opportunities that were a better fit. Insight prompt. What's one small, consistent action you could take this week that reflects your real values, even if no one notices? Theory in action. Identify one area of your life where you feel the urge to perform for approval. Replace one habitual performance with a genuine expression and observe how it feels for a week. Closing thoughts. So here's the thing about authenticity. It's not a costume you put on once and keep forever. It's a practice, sometimes awkward, sometimes messy, of returning to yourself again and again. There will be days when performance feels easier. There will be moments you catch yourself shaping your truth to fit the room. But the more you notice, the more you have the chance to choose differently. When you stop chasing the version of you that looks best from the outside, you make space for the version that feels best from the inside. And that version might not be as polished. It might be quieter in some rooms, bolder in others, and entirely uninterested in staying on brand. But it's yours. Living authentically doesn't mean sharing everything. It means that what you do share in words, actions, or silence comes from a place of integrity, not performance. And the people who connect with that, they'll be connecting with you, not the mask. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and stay true. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.